This is the last, third point. Now, his followers believed that he'd been resurrected. Now, I said before they made the claim that they'd seen him. Okay, but making the claim is different than actually believing it. They could have been lying, right? So 2 points here. First of all, if you read the actual writings of the apostles, we have plenty of writings of Paul. These were men of extremely high character, at least ostensibly. They urged people to be honest, to be caring, to go to their deaths doing good to others, to return good for evil. So these are not the kind of things that normally sort of conmen and charlatans would say. And you might be cynical and say, well, it's easy to tell other people to be honest, but they might have just been liars in it for the money. Who knows why they were doing it? Well, then you run up against the second problem. The apostles were intensely persecuted for their belief in the resurrection. So here's Paul's description in 2 Corinthians, another letter of his, again, unanimously agreed upon by scholars that this is his own writing. And he talks about some of the suffering that he himself endured as an apostle. He was lashed. He received 40 lashes minus one. The minus one is for mercy's sake. But he received that 5 different times. He was stoned. He was beaten with rods. He was shipwrecked. He was homeless. He was starving. And all of the apostles underwent similar treatment because of their belief in the resurrection. Now that's very hard to explain if they knew it was a lie, if they were just lying to people. So based on this treatment, again, most people agree, most historians affirm, the apostles actually believed what they were preaching about the resurrection. And they might have been wrong, but if they were wrong, they were just sincerely deceived. And in fact, we have good historical evidence that 3, and as many as 11, depending on how you weigh the historical evidence, but certainly 3 of the apostles were killed for their belief in the resurrection. Again, people die for what they think is true, what's actually false. But it's extremely rare for somebody to die for what they know they made up. And yet we have the apostles here being tortured and martyred for their faith in the resurrection. Again, for this reason, most historians agree they really believed what they were preaching. And finally, we have the apostle Paul himself. Paul was known as Saul of Tarsus, and he was actually an enemy of the early Christian church. He persecuted the church. He consented to the stoning of Stephen, and he went around from house to house throwing Christians in jail because he believed that they were a cult. And yet, on the road to Damascus, he suddenly converted to Christianity. And he says in his letter to the Galatians, again, it's unanimously agreed to be Pauline, that he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, and that's why he became a Christian. And the same narrative is recorded also in the book of Acts by Luke. Now, to see how sort of significant this is, the example I'd like to use until recently was Osama bin Laden. Now, he died, but before he died, imagine if he'd shown up one day in Washington, D.C., at one of the embassies, and he said, I'm here to turn myself in. I know now I was wrong because I saw Jesus, and I've now converted to Christianity. I saw the risen Christ, and here I am. You can throw me in jail or execute me, whatever you want, because I'm a Christian now. Now, we might say, well, he's gone crazy, right? But certainly something dramatic happened to him. There's this incredible shift in worldview that occurred, and something must have precipitated it. In the same way, how did Paul go from being an enemy of the early church to within 3 days becoming its chief proponent, an apostle? That's the question. So finally, those are 4 pieces of evidence that the majority of New Testament scholars affirm as historical. Now here's another piece of evidence I think is extremely interesting personally. What are the alternative explanations they offer? They say, well, we don't believe the resurrection happened. We think there are better explanations for those 4 pieces of evidence. So let me give you some of the alternative explanations that have been proposed over the centuries. And these are not just straw men. You can go Google them tonight. They've been used in public debates with Christians. They've been discussed in the literature ad nauseum. So here are some of them. The swoon theory. Jesus did not die on the cross. He just fainted. He woke up 3 days later in the tomb, woozy, pushed the stone boulder away, walked out, and convinced his disciples that he was the Lord of glory and that he'd risen from the dead. And then he died. He went off somewhere and died again, I guess. So, but that was, you laugh. That's still somewhat popular and extremely popular at one time. Second, the reburial hypothesis. Well, maybe Jesus was taken out of the tomb by Joseph on Friday for some unknown reason. He forgot to tell the disciples. They go there like, empty tomb. Jesus must be raised from the dead. And they go on telling everyone. And he said, well, what about Paul? What happened to Paul? And is that really enough? It's just an empty tomb, and why didn't Joseph just say, hey guys, sorry, I moved the body, my bad. But this is another one. This is, again, a popular alternative theory. The stolen body hypothesis. Well, maybe Jesus' disciples themselves stole the body, and then were tortured to death, for doing that and never recanted. Or maybe his family stole the body, and then on their way from stealing the body, they were killed by Roman soldiers and thrown into an unmarked grave, and 3 days later the bodies had all decayed, so no one knew what had happened to Jesus' brother and sister and Jesus himself, and the tomb was empty, and the disciples went on to proclaim his resurrection. And then Paul somehow also hallucinated or something. The hypnosis hypothesis. This was popular in the 19th century when hypnosis was popular. Jesus hypnotized before he died his followers into believing that he would be resurrected, and then they all thought he was. And this one, we'll talk about this in a bit, but we'll talk about this in a bit. Jesus had an identical twin who was mistaken for Jesus after his death. Okay. Now, these are again, you can Google these, you can hear them in debates. These are actual hypotheses that are offered by people. And then let me give you some quotes from non-Christians about the resurrection, the evidence for it. The first is from Anthony Flew. He was a very famous atheist who later in his life became a deist, but never became a Christian. And in fact, I think he did not believe the resurrection actually occurred. But here's what he had to say. The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstanding in quality and quantity. This is not a Christian talking. 2, this is Pinchas Lapid. He's a Jewish scholar. He believed that the resurrection was a historical event. Now, I'm not sure how that works, because he's Jewish, but he did affirm that it happened. And finally, this is a great essay by Jeff Loder. He is the founder and former president of infidels.org, which was one of the biggest atheist websites on the internet. It's a great essay he wrote called The Historicity of Jesus' Resurrection. And he says it is rational to both believe and disbelieve in the resurrection. Both Christians and atheists are correct within their own worldviews. Now, why would he say that? What he basically says is that Christians believe in the resurrection based on their belief in God and the evidence. But why do atheists disbelieve in the resurrection? What he says basically is they disbelieve in the resurrection not because of lack of evidence, but because they lack belief in God. If God doesn't exist, then he can't raise Jesus from the dead. Right? So he says until atheists are shown that God is a plausible hypothesis, they will not believe in the resurrection. It's not lack of evidence, as he says, is that they don't believe that God is plausible. Okay, so let's go back now to 2 particular people I want to mention. So the first is, again, Dr. Bart Ehrman, who teaches at UNC, a former Christian. And this is from his debate with Dr. William Lane Craig on March 25th, 2006. If you look at these statements, I'm not going to read them all, but he basically says that any naturalistic explanation, that does not appeal to miracles, is to be preferred over any explanation that involves the miraculous, period. The miraculous, the supernatural, is so implausible that no one can accept an explanation based on the miraculous. And he mentions the stolen body hypothesis that I mentioned, and he says this is a highly unlikely scenario, but you don't have to appeal to supernatural intervention to make it work. Well, that's what miracles are. They're supernatural intervention. So it's really begging the question, well, what if the supernatural could occur? Are we really to say it's so implausible that anything is preferred? And he even mentions, again, the twin hypothesis. Maybe Jesus had a twin brother. And if you want to get a real dose of the twin hypothesis, I suggest you listen to this debate. This is Dr. William Lane Craig again, and Greg Caven. Greg Caven is also a former Christian. And he spends 40 minutes defending tooth and nail the twin hypothesis. His theory is that Jesus was a member of an identical twin pair, and one of the twins was swapped at birth with Mary and Joseph's son, so the guy who grew up as Jesus was really one of a pair of twins. The other guy, William Lane Craig dubs Dave, from the movie Dave, if you guys have seen that. So Jesus and Dave grow up apart, not knowing each other, and then for some reason, Dave is curious, he happens to stumble into Jerusalem right on the eve of Passover when Jesus is getting crucified, and he thinks to himself, I think I'm going to impersonate Jesus. So he waits and he gets some other people to conspire with him, and he steals the body. Then he appears to the disciples and says, I'm Jesus. and they are convinced he's resurrected. And he defends this hypothesis over and over and over again. He goes so far as to say that Dave actually somehow faked the scars on his hands, like with makeup or something, to fool the disciples into thinking it was Jesus. But again, the underlying reasoning here, he's very explicit, is that any naturalistic hypothesis is to be preferred over any miraculous hypothesis. He even says, in passing, well, maybe extraterrestrials stole Jesus' body, right, and impersonated him. Now, he doesn't go into detail about that, but he does mention that as another possible explanation, because it's not miraculous. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that there are alternative explanations out there, but they are very, very unlikely. And by the way, in that debate where he defends the twin hypothesis, he even also says that all the other hypotheses are far worse, far less plausible. That's his opinion.